Now when you start your animation, try not to get caught up in details, just blocking the main idea and the story that you're trying to communicate in your scene. So for a simple walk, I'm going to set up my camera. Then open up the timeline and turn on auto key insertion so it'll set a keyframe each time something is moved. I'll begin by putting in the contact positions for each step. You can be even more general if you want to, but for this example I'll start here. Make sure to keyframe all the bone channels for each pose to keep things consistent. The general format for a walk is contact positions, passing position, and then the up and the down. I recommend checking out the Animator survival kit because it has a lot of really useful reference for different kinds of walks, runs, jumps, and a lot of other stuff. This is called pose-to-pose animation, by the way. So I'm putting in these poses on consecutive frames because I don't want to worry about the timing right now, and it's easier for me to keep track of the motion this way. If you have dialogue though, you'll probably want to consider timing right away. Once the key poses are put in, I'm going to select everything and hit T to change the interpolation to linear, and start putting in my breakdown poses. This is where you start getting into more detail with your animation and breaking down the movement. Again, keyframe everything each time because it'll just make things simpler. You can clean up keyframes you don't need later with a single command. Since it's on linear now, Blender will generate the in-between poses, but you should keep in mind that this is only a tool and not a way for the program to just auto-complete your work. You need to stay in control of your animation by giving the program enough data to work with. The less you put in, the more control the program will have, which will result in very floaty and robotic looking movement. Now, in order to put in valuable information, you need to understand animation and the principles behind it, such as weight, spacing, squash and stretch, overlapping action, and so on. I'm not going to go over all of that here, but I'll post some stuff you can check out in the description. I like to keep each of these stages in separate files, so I don't overwrite my data in case I want to backtrack or start something over. It's also good to keep multiple copies just in case a file gets corrupted or you accidentally delete something. Once the breakdowns are done, we can move on to timing. Turn on vsync in the timeline so it doesn't lag, and if you want, you can turn on show seconds to see exactly how long your animation is going to be. Change the interpolation mode to constant since we don't want in-betweens now, and start spreading your keyframes out on the timeline. You can use Alt right click to select all the keyframes on a certain frame, and Control right click to select all keyframes to the left or right of the cursor. You can scale everything up and then work from that if it helps you. Just know that your keyframes aren't always going to be evenly spaced. For this example, they are, but you'll want to play around with it to achieve different effects. Also, if you need to hold a pose, just duplicate your keyframes and move them until where you want the pose to change. Once everything seems to be working and it looks good, we can move on to polishing. But don't hesitate to go in and add more poses if you feel you need to. Select all of your channels, not your keyframes, but your bone channels, and go to Key, Clean Keyframes, or just hit O. Then change everything back to linear and open the graph editor. The graph editor is basically a visual representation of your animation. So if you select a bone, you can see what are called F-curves here, which represent how all of the values transition between keyframes, which are the black dots. The values are broken down into location, rotation, and scale, and for each there's an F-curve for the X, Y, and Z axis. Now obviously it's a bit complicated to look at everything at once, so I'm going to work with one thing at a time. I'm going to turn off everything and then turn on the Y location channel, which will show the up and down motion of the pelvis. In this case, the bone is actually upside down, so the curves are going to be flipped, and I'm also going to turn off auto snap so we can move keyframes without any restriction. So what I want to do at this stage is essentially add definition to my curves. The reason I'm doing this in linear is because it just keeps things nice and simple so that I can start blocking in the smoothness and all the subtleties of my animation. So something like easing in or out, although I indicate it in my breakdowns, here I can actually get into detail and make it exactly how I want it rather than letting Blender interpret it based on 2 or 3 poses. Always consider weight in your animation. This more ties into theory stuff, which again I'll put in the description, but if something comes to a dead stop as indicated by a really sharp and flat F-curve, it'll come off as lacking momentum, which could affect the believability of your animation. So once the F-curve editing is done and everything looks good, we can convert everything to spline or Bezier as it's called in Blender, and then start tweaking the tangents to make sure everything's working as it should. You can always use the clean keyframes command again if your tangents seem out of control. Oftentimes when you're animating, you'll want your character holding onto something, and you can achieve this by parenting the object directly onto the rig. You should use the DEF bones so that the object won't be affected by IK/FK switches and will always stay parented. But this doesn't really work if you want the character to pick up or drop the object, and for this you can use the child of constraint. To use this, make sure your object is parented to a bone. Add a child of constraint to the bone, turn it off, and set a keyframe. Put in the bone you want the object to parent to. Then on the next frame, turn on the constraint and add another keyframe. It's going to fly off at first, so hit set inverse to fix that. Always keep these two keyframes next to each other so that it parents instantly without flipping out or anything. If you unparent it, it'll go back to its original spot, so you'll have to manually keyframe it to where you want it to go. So to conclude, I want to state that this is just the approach that I've been taking for my videos. This isn't the best or the only way to do it, and although there's usually some similarities, different sources will tell you different things. Try different methods and pick what works best for you. In the next part, I'm going to go over lighting your scene and finalizing everything for rendering.